Not quite a year ago, we gathered some of our New Lines colleagues on this podcast to discuss something astonishing, something many of us in the magazine had barely expected to happen: the collapse of the regime of Bashar al-Assad. For Syrians themselves, that change was momentous. It was the end of a decades-long system of repression and authoritarianism started all the way back in 1971 under Bashar's father, Hafez. The new occupant of Syria's presidential palace is Ahmad al-Sharaa, a man who has undergone a remarkable transformation. Once branded a terrorist by the US with a bounty on his head just a year ago, he last week became the first Syrian president in the modern era to visit the White House. Al-Sharaa is by no means universally popular. As we've discussed in a previous episode, a series of terrible massacres were committed on the Syrian coast and around the southern city of Sweda during his time in office. But he is nonetheless playing a deft political game, managing to keep both Washington and his former Russian adversaries on side. This huge change in Syria is also significant for what it means for the region more widely. For the first time this century, Iran, one of the region's major power brokers, no longer enjoys a contiguous land bridge from its own borders to the eastern Mediterranean via Iraq and through Syria. That has made Iraq, Iran's neighbour, an ever more important ally, as we'll hear. Al-Sharaa is not the only Arab leader to fly to DC this month. Tomorrow, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman goes to the White House. For America, Saudi is now the most important Arab country, and Trump sees the Saudis as the linchpin of a changing guard in the Middle East. Intriguingly, one might expect Saudi Arabia to try and capitalize on a diminished Iran, following a battering for its axis of allies during the Gaza war. And yet, Riyadh and Tehran have pursued a surprising rapprochement. What then do these wider shifts herald? What new power dynamics are playing out? What can we learn from Iraq's election, the visit of the Syrian president, and MBS in the White House? To discuss the significance of some of these changes, we asked onto the podcast the Financial Times' Middle East correspondent, Raya Jalabi, fresh from a reporting trip to Baghdad, to offer her thoughts on Iraq's elections, as well as Robin Yassin-Kassab, a returning guest, to offer his thoughts on developments inside Syria and their wider regional implications. I'm Faisal Al Yafai. Welcome to this week's episode of The Lead. Raya Jalabi, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
You were in Baghdad recently, and I think as we're recording on Wednesday, the first results are coming in. Are you hearing what they're reporting, that it looks like Soudani might actually win, or his bloc might win at least?
Yeah, definitely. I think that was the widespread expectation, that his bloc would do the best across the country. So we're starting to see those results come in, and it looks like he has, won a majority of the votes, of the vote share.
And to what do you attribute that? What was it, do you think, that made him popular? Because it's, his second term, and that's normally a bad thing in Iraqi circles.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I had an Iraqi politician, a senior figure in the ruling coalition recently tell me that if you ever want Iraq to succeed, you don't want a prime minister to seek a second term. So I think the idea isn't one that's very popular in Iraq, especially not amongst the ruling elite. Soudani is...
Just so I understand, what's the logic of that they don't want a politician to seek a second term?
Yeah, because for a lot of the other members of the ruling coalition that dominates Iraqi politics, they want to sort of have ultimate control over the expropriation mechanisms of the state institutions. So if you have a popular prime minister who comes in, someone like Soudani, who has this popular base, then he's going to want to do things his way, and he's going to want to do things differently, as he has done the last 3 years. So it's chafed against their interests. So really, when we talk about Iraq, it's really about competing interests over state resources. That's really what dominates the direction of its politics.
And how do you interpret his win in the context of these competing resources?
So it's interesting. The last couple of years have been tumultuous for the region, to say the least. But for Iraq, it's been relatively stable, and it's been an unexpected, beacon of stability. And that has allowed for a lot of development projects. That's allowed for Soudani to push major infrastructure projects that have been really popular with people. And I think if you look at what he's done over the last 3 years, he came in and sort of had this agenda of infrastructure and development and his electoral coalition is called the Reconstruction and Development Coalition. So this whole idea, and even on his campaign posters, you see him in a crane. It's him in a hard hat, and the crane is the logo of the electoral list. So he's really pushing this idea that he's someone who can get things done. He's an infrastructure guy. He can make your lives better. And that idea has resonated with a lot of people. And I think he has, people have attributed the sort of last 3 years of stability to him largely, whether fairly or not. Yeah.
Yeah, especially as you say, during this tumultuous Gaza war. You wrote a report from Baghdad earlier this week. I wanted to ask you about how you perceive the Shia militias inside Iraq and what you think their role is in the election and potentially during this coalition building period.
So if we look back at the last couple of years, we've seen that a lot of members of Iran's axis of, so-called axis of resistance in the region have taken a real battering, from Hamas to Hezbollah. They've been degraded in their capabilities, and they've also just seen a sort of generalized threat to their existence. And differently, but the Iraqi militias haven't had that be the case. I mean, initially they participated post October 7th, 2023. They participated in launching attacks against American installations in Iraq, thinking, that the sort of narrative was, well, Washington is backing Israel in this war, and so therefore we must attack its installations. They were rogue groups. It wasn't necessarily the sort of main establishment groups that we know of, the sort of main Shia militias in Iraq that were doing this. But still, you had this sort of sequence of attacks that lasted for about 4 months. And that went into February 2024. And then they killed, in one incident, they killed 3 American service members, and there was heavy retaliation from Washington. So that shifted the dynamic, right? So that at that point, they retreat, they go quiet, they stop attacking, and they sort of, in a way, do as they're told. And throughout my reporting the last couple of years, and especially on this last trip, I was sort of probing why that was. Like, is that due to domestic interests? Are they protecting certain economic interests? Was that because of a policy dictated from Tehran? And it seems to be that, and this is certainly the way certain militia leaders described it to me, as well as certain sort of senior Iraqi politicians, they say that it was sort of motivated by fear and opportunism in a way, because they had to protect their economic interests, certainly. So Iraq's militias had this sprawling network of economic assets across the country. And of course, it's important to remember that unlike Hezbollah in Lebanon, the militias in Iraq are diffuse. There are many, many different groups that fall under this umbrella organization, and they are spread across the country. So they have very important economic assets that Iran looks to for as essential, because in many ways, as sort of someone described it to me last week, Iraq has long been Iran's cash cow. So a lot of the groups around the region, and including in Iran, get funded by money that comes out of Iraq. So the collective decision was sort of made at the time that, they needed to pull back, and they needed to avoid retribution from Washington and potentially Israeli drones. And so they did. And so that sort of momentum meant that they were able to think about their next steps. And what you see that's happened over the last year is that there was a concerted effort to pivot towards politics by these groups.
Right.
So this is something that we sort of noticed. They've been engaged. Many of them have been involved in politics for a long time. Certainly back to
of course,
20.
Yeah.
So 2014, 2018, some of these groups ran candidates, but it's different this time, or at least it looks different. You can never really discern what the underlying motivation is, but it looks different. They're talking a very different game. So these militia groups, having survived this very precarious moment of the last couple of years, are now sort of thinking, okay, what next? What do we have to do next to survive, to continue surviving? And so they have this political pivot, and it's one that's motivated by opportunism of, regarding their economic assets, because they see the state as a valuable resource for them to extract more resources and more money. And at the same time, fear, because they know that Washington and Israel are sort of hovering overhead. And certainly we've seen statements coming out of Israel. Netanyahu recently threatened that the militias, if they got in his way, would certainly come into his sights. And you've seen more aggressive action from Washington recently, namely, US sort of got very involved in trying to block, and they successfully blocked this draft law that was being pushed through in Iraq to sort of institutionalize the militias further into the state. So all of this is sort of at play when you think about that political pivot.
You quote, because I think the interesting part of it is that the militias have to consider their own political opportunity, because they're not just like part of this axis of resistance. And I imagine that they look at what's happening in Iraq, they look at what's happening elsewhere in the region, and even they look at, as you say, their paymasters in Iraq. Paymasters is overstating it. It's like an alliance. But anyway, and they say, well, do we want to come to the aid of the Gazans? Do we want to come to the aid of the Iranians and potentially lose everything? Or is there something else that we can gain from this moment? So you quote an MP as saying that this is the Popular Mobilization Brigades, put on their nice suits and say they're politicians now, but that's even more dangerous. With their guns, the militias will not only dominate the state, they will soon be the state. That is a real potential problem for the Iraqi state, because you have this large group of, as you say, diffuse militias outside of the control of the state, but all of them well-trained, heavy weaponry, political ambitions.
Yeah. It's important to note that with the PMF, they are both, so their origin, their genesis comes at a moment where Iraq is under attack from ISIS. So there's this popular call out by the leading Shia cleric in Iraq, and he says, join up the resistance to ISIS. Since that moment, they get further institutionalized in the state over the last decade. So they were formally integrated into the state's armed forces. So you have a branch of the PMF that is formally on payroll from the state, right? So like these groups, but of course, because of the nature of their relationships to regional actors, because of the nature of their own leadership, they don't always do as they're told. They rarely do as they're told. So you not only have these formal PMF, but you also have these sort of rogue actors within other, sort of that aren't on payroll officially by the state, but they're still considered part of these militia groups. And they sort of are used as leverage domestically to sort of enact any kind of policy or interest that the groups want. So that's the sort of background to that. Now, they have progressively creeped into the state as over the years, and it's very interesting to sort of watch. Like, I've been documenting this for the last decade, really, and what you see is this sort of realization, this sort of evolution in their thinking that I think has sort of crystallized at this particular moment. And one of the people I interview throughout the piece is the current Minister of Labour and Social Affairs, who used to be the spokesman for the PMF, right? And so he was a guy that we used to interact with quite frequently. He was the spokesman for the resistance in Iraq, and he would say things that were very much in keeping with.
He was part of the fighting group. He may not fight himself, but he was part of it.
Oh yes, like he was and he was the formal spokesperson of the group. So he still is the leader of a militia group, but he says, he's the leader, but not a military commander, but he is the sort of nominal leader of this group. And he says, he used to say things that were very in keeping with what you would expect, the narrative that comes out of that camp, the resistance ideology. And now when I saw him in Baghdad a couple of weeks ago, he really had shifted his tone, and he was talking a lot about state building.
Shifted his clothing too.
Shifted his clothing, yes. He's no longer wearing these fatigues, but that he sort of shed those.
They Ahmad al-Shara'd him.
Yeah, well, he did it himself because he's also quite an ambitious and smart guy, right? So he essentially, and he says this himself, we shed our fatigues and sort of started to dress as civilians. And so this has been a sort of long project. And what's so interesting about him is that he sort of talks now about pluralism, and he talked a big game about minorities when I spoke to him, and yes, of course he knows he's talking to a Western media outlet and he knows what he's doing, but he's also just, I think there is this narrative that you would never have heard from them a few years ago. Right. And so he sort of embodies this transition that you've seen over the last decade, from these rogue actors to statesmen. And what's so interesting about them is that I think these militia leaders and these groups, they see themselves as state actors. They've never seen themselves as non-state actors, and so they feel very much embedded in the fabric of the state. And so there is also a feeling of entitlement, I would say, to state resources. So, a big part of the motivation for their further and deeper involvement in the state is corruption. And Iraq is, it's a 20-year-old democracy, but it's also one that is plagued by endemic corruption from the very beginning. So it's baked into the entire political structure of how things are done. What's important for all of these political parties and these armed groups is to get control of ministries, to get control of senior civil servant positions in these ministries, to then sort of funnel government contracts and state resources to their group. So it's all about patronage. And so really that is a big driver of why these groups sort of have been doing all this.
Let's take a step back and think about the larger picture across the Middle East. Because if you think about the region a year or two ago, you would have been able to draw a line all the way across from Iraq to Lebanon. And these are all countries in which Iran had significant, not complete, but significant support. Of course, there have been big changes with Hezbollah in particular and Hamas. But really, you would probably say that the single biggest moment was the collapse of Bashar al-Assad regime. Because you now no longer have, I mean, you see Ahmad al-Sharaa has just been in Washington.
Yeah.
Amazing. First time, I think, in 40 years.
First time ever for a Syrian leader.
For a Syrian leader to be in DC. Amazing. And that means now that Iran no longer has this land bridge that it was trying to create. A really significant change in terms of how Iran views itself in the region. But I wonder also if you think it makes a difference in terms of how Iran views Iraq.
Iraq will always be Iran's most important ally in the region. And I think it's something, it's aspirational to think that that relationship will ever be severed. They share an enormous border and they share deep cultural and historic ties. And a lot of the current political and militia leadership sought refuge in Iraq under Saddam. And so really there is a very deep relationship that it will be sort of, in the current iteration, will be impossible to sever. Now, that relationship, it doesn't mean that that relationship doesn't evolve. And I think something we've been writing for several years now is really that this is not a hierarchical top-down relationship. This is a sort of fluid relationship, especially after the death of Qasem Soleimani. You have this this different relationship that sort of emerges where the PMF essentially they start prioritizing their domestic interests more. And what's so interesting about that, I think, is really it is dominated by an extraction of resources, of course, but that is because they think about individual survival as opposed to thinking about the regional axis. And what I find fascinating is that in the last couple of years, the militias that are part of the regional axis, they sort of talked a big game about the unity of fronts, which was this theory that Iran sort of structured for its regional axis groups that meant, it's one front, it's one battle, we're all in this together, right? But then, you
Hamas,
talk to them.
Hezbollah, the Houthis, the PMF, like
exactly.
This.
And you've seen everyone sort of play their part, except for the Iraqis, really. So they really didn't get that involved. And when you talk to them about it now, a lot of them say, well, we sort of expected Hezbollah to take the lead on this because they have a border, and we don't have a border, and really it's not really our problem. And so they sort of have a very different tune on the whole dynamic. Yeah,
they slightly pull back a bit and they start to prioritize their own political survival.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of Iraqis, especially a lot of Shia Iraqis, they don't see the Palestinian cause as they don't feel it as deeply as the rest of the region, and that has a lot to do with the country's own history with the Palestinian refugees who came to the country under Saddam. But I think that relationship is different. It's different to the rest of the region. So you did used to have this sort of regional axis that was very was intimidating to sort of others in the region. And that has disintegrated, and this land bridge has disintegrated in many ways, even though you are still seeing some interceptions of weapons coming in from Syria into Lebanon. So the fact that they're being intercepted means, okay, you have Syrian authorities that are trying to stop this from happening. But it also means, that we're seeing, what we're seeing is a fraction probably of what's getting in.
I am interested in the changing nature of it. I mean, because as much as you say, Hezbollah has been dismantled to some large degree, and Hamas too, actually the Iranians seem to be playing a much longer game with Iraq, and considering that they don't need to fight this war using their Iraqi assets right now. They can wait, take control of the state completely, and then they will be in a much stronger position than they were with Hezbollah.
I don't think they actually want to take control of the state completely. I mean, from my conversations and from everything I know from having reported in the country for a long time, it's that they're comfortable with the status quo, which is that they have these relationships, they can extract when they want to extract, they can get their cash when they want to get it, and they don't need to be overly involved. I mean, I think Iran, what was clear from this trip compared to previous years is that you have this feeling that there's domestic concerns are overtaking in Iran, and the Iranian sort of state apparatus is concerned with its own domestic affairs and certainly its own conflict with Israel. And so it's less hands-on in Iraq, which means what they care about is just that money keeps flowing in the way that it has been to Tehran and to its regional groups. And that's kind of the only thing that counts. So they can do whatever they want to do internally, but, as long as it doesn't go too far in the direction of splitting Shia unity, but they're not as hands-on as they have been.
The other Arab leader to have visited the White House, or will visit the White House by the time this goes out, is Mohammed bin Salman, who's going on Monday. And it's interesting, I think, that also heralds a change in the relationship with the Saudis and Iran, because now they are not in the same position that they were just a few years ago, where they were looking at each other at loggerheads. They now seem to be trying to figure out a way to be on the same page.
The entire region has shifted its colours. I mean, it's clear that you have a complete reshuffling of the board prompted by the fallout from October 7th, right? So you have these shifting alliances, and you have also Trump has been a wake-up call for a lot of people in the region, and an understanding that, certainly for Saudi Arabia, their sort of, the attack on their oil facilities in 2019 looms large in their minds. So they know that America might not come to its rescue if they need it to. So that was part of the impetus for why they shifted towards reconciling with Iran.
It's kind of crazy that people have forgotten that. That was an astonishing moment for the Saudis.
Yeah, it was sort of their defining moment in the last few years. I mean, I think they realized that, that it would have been unthinkable 10 years ago that to see the Saudi-Iran rapprochement, and then all of a sudden you have this sort of friendship that emerges and the ashes of that attack and the shifts of the last couple of years. And I think you have it's all born through strategic calculus, and they're all thinking about their own interests. But ultimately, Iran and Saudi are a lot closer together geographically, and they know that if there's an attack to come in the future, that they'll be in the line of fire. So they have to protect their own interests. But I think, you see those shifting sounds across the region too. You look at Lebanon, and there's more sort of Saudi conversations there's more sort of direct conversations with the Lebanese. There's sort of more of an interest in trying to resolve that tension, because Saudi has been very disengaged on Lebanon for the last decade, really, since the sort of institutionalization of Hezbollah and a lot of its state. So
yeah, I think this is the part I think that I was most interested in exploring on the podcast, that it's not the fallout of the Gaza war is not merely that America and its allies are now the strong dominant ones in the region, and this axis of resistance, you say, has been dismantled. Actually, it's much more complicated than that. That all these various actors have looked at the last couple of years and just before it and have said there are big changes coming and we need to adapt to it, and we're not going to adapt to it in the old structure of pro-American or anti-American. So even countries like Saudi, which are so tightly bound with America, are still not looking to a completely pro-America future. They're looking to a Saudi first future.
Yeah, it's realpolitik, right? And I think I mean, I will say, I don't think that, I wouldn't use the word dismantled about the axis, because I think we're overestimating, I think, how much their capabilities have been degraded, especially on Hezbollah. Like, I think no one actually knows the extent to which they have been fully degraded. But, and despite what the Israelis say on a daily basis, but I think it is, it's something to bear in mind, because as power reconstitutes itself and as these groups start to reconstitute themselves, which they are doing, they are reforming, certainly in the case of Hezbollah, they've renamed everyone to their post that was assassinated. They've sort of gotten a whole new line of internal debate on this stuff. And so I think they are positioning themselves for a future, because they certainly see a future where they're in it. And in order to negotiate that, they've got to reconstitute what power looks like and what regional alliances look like.
I completely agree. And I like this term that you use, that they're trying to reconstitute what power looks like. Because you're right. I mean, Hezbollah hasn't gone away. Indeed, Hamas hasn't gone away. They're still putting people in positions of, they still manage to have command and control over the whole of the Gaza Strip. Who knows? In any case, they're still trying to reconstitute what it will look like in the aftermath of the Gaza war. And they're considering, well, what will our power look like? How much will we be able to influence the Lebanese government? How much will we be able to resist the disarmament that they think is coming? These sorts of things. And I think that part is so fascinating, because into the mix of that, you now have Syria, of course, you have Turkey, you have, of course, the Houthis. Who would have imagined the Houthis have suddenly become this international power force, which they definitely were not prior to Gaza.
Yeah.
And so now they are something to consider. Anyway, this is why I think it is so interesting, because there is so much shifting.
Well, it's also why Iraq is such an interesting case study, right? Because, it's been this country that's the epitome of the sort of Washington-Iran struggle, right? They're constantly trying to balance these two interests, and have been since 2003. So in its ability to do that, it also has often undermined how much of its own national interest should be at play, right? And so now, something that I was hearing a lot, and what's so interesting actually is that they're so inspired by Trump and Trump's style of leadership, because exactly. But they do love a strong man. So I think seeing them talk about Iraq first as a policy, they're sort of talking about, that's why state building has become such an important narrative. It's because, we're putting our national interest first, we're putting our state first. And obviously the militias and others know that it's because they've been tainted by accusations indications that they do Iran's bidding and that's it. But they are sort of working hard to sort of develop this narrative of Iraq first. And certainly there's a whole new generation of politician and technocrat that's in the state now that is sort of interested in prioritizing Iraq. So that complexity, it adds nuance to this binary that has existed for the last 20 years.
If Iraq has emerged since the invasion 20 years ago as a site of constant contestation between the US and its allies in Tehran, then the new Syria may also find itself playing a similar role. Tehran's influence is more muted these days in Damascus, but Ahmad al-Sharaa already finds himself walking a political tightrope between the established superpowers of the United States and Russia, as well as growing regional powers such as Saudi Arabia. The Leeds producer, Finbar Anderson, was just in Damascus on the same days that Sharaa was in Washington, and, hello Finn, it certainly feels like a changing city.
Hi, Faisal. Yeah, it's great to be with you. And it does. It really feels like a changing city. I mean, most obviously in some of the iconography around the city. So none of the flags of the former regime, none of the images of Bashar al-Assad, which kind of so ubiquitous from the many years, from the photographs that we would have seen, the videos that we would have seen of Damascus and Syria more widely. Almost all of those have been painted over. The photographs of Bashar al-Assad torn down. I remember once seeing an image of his face used as a mat outside a kind of corner shop, and people were just walking over it. But otherwise, Bashar's image and that flag have almost disappeared.
They have a picture of him on the ground at the airport as you go into Damascus.
Yeah, exactly. So I understand.
So that is a big change. And another change, I think, is that, you used to see in the tourist shops, they would sell a lot of Iranian and Hezbollah iconography. All of that has gone away.
Yeah, I didn't see any of that when I was there. I did drive past the Iranian embassy in Damascus at one point, and it was completely shuttered. It looked like it had been pretty badly damaged, I think, from an Israeli airstrike that happened just a few months ago. Basically, the images, the merch, if you like, that you can buy nowadays, it's all Free Syria. It's the green, white, and black of the new flag, which is actually the old flag of Syria from before the time of the Assad regime, and all these kind of scarves saying "Welcome to a free Syria." Yeah, it's quite something.
And lots of people seem to have taken that to heart. I mean, you really see quite a lot of tourists now from the Gulf, and I think particularly in our circles, there's a lot of journalists now.
Yeah, there's absolutely journalists going through. There are tourists. So I went to the kind of main souk in the middle of Damascus, the Hamidiyya souk. Went to the most famous ice cream shop that you can go to, which is called Baghdad. And I couldn't walk. I had tourists kind of cramming into me from either side, and yeah, I could barely move through the shop. It was noticeable though that the tourists at this stage are largely kind of Gulf tourists, maybe a handful from Europe and the United States or South and East Asia, but largely from the Gulf at the moment, or perhaps from Iraq and elsewhere in Syria.
And I think one of the aspects of the changing dynamics, which actually Sharaa and Trump talked about, is the impact of sanctions. You can still see visibly that the economy is crippled. You don't have electronic payments at all anymore, which is kind of crazy.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is really visible throughout the city. So it's a completely cash economy. I mean, there's barely any places where you can take any kind of online payment, a card payment, a Swift payment, anything like that. So you really notice when you go into a restaurant, when you go into a shop or a hotel, all of them have got these little kind of cash counting machines, like you might see at a kind of cash exchange or something like that, because the inflation of the currency is so bad. I spoke to one shopkeeper who was remembering the days when you could buy a kilo of vegetables for a few Syrian lira, for example, and now, it's 10,000 to the dollar. So you're carrying, you need a separate bag just to kind of carry your cash. And you also notice as well that one of the only places where you will see Bashar al-Assad's face is on the side of the 2,000 lira note.
Oh,
so
wow.
That's like a kind of visible demonstration of how they're still waiting for the sanctions relief to kick in, which it is supposed to be doing. And we are anticipating at some point in the near future for Syria to be relinked to the kind of global economy, which it desperately need to be.
And I think, because there's so many Syrians abroad and in the diaspora, and I think once that happens, you will really see a shift in the economy of the city and the country. Well, one of the things that I loved about hearing your experiences in Damascus is that there are so many Syrians going back. And this is one of the most interesting parts about it. The Syrians over the last 10 years, they've had this horrible civil war, and they've managed to build a successful life for themselves in the diaspora. And yet, not even a year after this transformation, they're going back. They're going to rebuild the country.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was one of the most encouraging signs, to be honest. I mean, no one's under any illusions that Syria is going to turn overnight back into a kind of leading regional economy. But it's certainly, it has been that in the past, and it has that potential. And so many of my friends are going back, and they're taking jobs back in the country, even though they know that the salaries are currently really low. They're starting business ventures. They're going back to old family business ventures, anticipating that day will come where it does get better. And that was absolutely
amazing. It is quite inspiring. I think we talked about it previously on the podcast, I think, when we've had others on the team, that the idea that you throw away this life that you've built in other countries in the Gulf or in the West or other Arab countries just to go back to rebuild the country. But they're so keen to do it. They really genuinely feel this is a transformative moment, and they're willing to put their own careers, their own money on the line in order to do it. It's, I'm genuinely inspired by this change.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a lot riding on this moment as well. There was one friend that I spoke to who was really keen to get involved in Syria right now, because he's not totally confident in Syria's current president, Ahmad al-Sharaa. He's so grateful that the days of Bashar al-Assad are in the past, but he's skeptical of Ahmad al-Sharaa. And he says, this is the time. This is the time where if we're going to have the opportunity to influence the direction of the country in the way that we want to take it, then we've got to do it now.
Amazing. Well, that sounds fascinating. Let's hear then from Robin Yassin-Kassab. Robin Yassin-Kassab, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
We wanted to discuss the shifting geopolitics of the region, and I think Syria is a useful canvas on which to see the effects of it. What do you think the visit of al-Sharaa signifies, not just for Syria, but on a regional level?
Oh, it signifies a lot of things at once. Firstly, he's joined Syria has officially joined the anti-ISIS, the global coalition against ISIS, which in itself is not a surprise because there's been indirect cooperation between the coalition and HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, in Idlib for many years. There's been at least eight joint operations since Ahmad al-Sharaa became the transitional president of Syria. But what's really politically significant is that this means that the SDF, the Kurdish-run militia that controls large parts of northeastern Syria, can no longer claim to be the coalition's boots on the ground, its only boots on the ground in Syria. That's now been taken over by the central Syrian government. So that means that the SDF no longer has its most important card. So this should be understood as an important step towards the unification or the reunification of Syria under central control. That's one thing that it does. There are other things that it does, which I could go on to talk about. One very interesting thing that it does, the fact that Ahmad al-Sharaa is in Washington being welcomed at the White House, the first time a Syrian leader has been welcomed, I think, ever at the White House. And this does various things. There's also been rumors, which have been denied by both sides, that the Syrians may be offering the Americans an air base in Syria, not in SDF territory, in centrally controlled Syria. And both sides have denied that, but there's still kind of a little bit of talk about that. And certainly American planes have been landing in Mezze military air base. Now, that's very interesting because that air base was the first one that was really heavily bombed by the Israelis on December the 8th last year. So when the Assad regime collapsed and the Israelis immediately began advancing from the Golan Heights further into Syria and bombing everything, every military asset that they could find in Syria, Mezze military airport was the first place that they bombed, and the one they bombed most heavily. The fact that American planes are now landing there, I don't think this is going to immediately translate into America actually doing something to stop Israeli aggression. That's still a long way away. But it certainly does point up the increasing divergence between US interests and Israeli interests in the region. So I think it's really intelligent politics.
Well, perhaps it might represent a change in the way that the Trump administration sees Syria's role in the new Middle East.
I mean, I think it's in the whole world's interests for Syria to stabilize. There's no doubt about that. America, the EU in particular, where the far right is rising, they want refugees to go home. They don't want the war to continue, so there are further waves of refugees. Nobody wants Captagon and other narcotics pouring out of Syria towards the Gulf and Egypt, as has been happening. The Turks really don't want more Syrian refugees. So it's Tom Barak, the US Special Envoy to Syria, recently said in interview that there is no plan B. And I think everybody recognizes that if if they don't work with Ahmad al-Sharaa and the transitional government, there's nobody else to work with. He may be problematic in some ways, although actually not for the West, because he's doing everything that they are asking, everything that they want. But the other option, the alternative to Ahmad al-Sharaa at the moment is total chaos and probably sectarian civil war and a situation in which ISIS and drug smuggling and refugees would all boom.
Sometimes when I hear this kind of language from analysts, I think to myself, are we back in the 2011 era with Assad? Because the same thing was said about him, right? The alternative to Assad is the chaos and the sectarian war that we saw in Iraq. And I ask myself, are we not looking at this through the wrong end of the lens? We should be asking what kind of Syria is going to be built for Syrians, not what kind of Syria is going to be built for Europeans and other Arabs.
Well, I think the two coincide. I mean, I'm certainly not interested in a new dictatorship in Syria which serves the West and then gets patted on the head but is murdering citizens. Some people on social media over the last day or two have been saying how cynical of the West to be making friends with this guy just because he's doing what they want him to do now. But actually, in this case, there's no cynicism involved at all. They've stuck to their principles. They were very clear that they wouldn't deal with Salafi jihadists who cooperate with transnational terror organizations. And Ahmad al-Sharaa stopped being a Salafi jihadist. He's cut loose from ISIS. He's had a war with ISIS for years. He's purged al-Qaeda people from his ranks. And he did that not because he wanted to please the West. He did that because he was responding to internal domestic Syrian politics. The West has now looked around and said, okay, now we're dealing with somebody who isn't a Salafi jihadist, who is fighting al-Qaeda, who is fighting ISIS, who is also against the Iranian militias, which we don't like. He's fighting against drugs and Captagon smuggling. And he's doing all of this for his own reasons, but we can work with the guy. Now, inside Syria, it is certainly true that inside Syria in March, there were horrific atrocities committed against Alawites on the coast. And in July, there were horrific massacres, sectarian massacres of Druze in the south. In that fighting, lots of Bedouin were also hurt and displaced. And yet, we can now see, it wasn't actually very clear at the time, but now it's become much clearer to those who are watching very closely, that Ahmad al-Sharaa's government has arrested hundreds of people responsible for those crimes on the coast and in Sweda.
I want us to slightly move away from the securitization discussion. I want us to think about what is the new Syria going to look like, and what is this Middle East that is being built around it going to look like?
Well, the new Syria, I mean, I don't think he wants to go back to absolute dictatorship, because I think there is now a taboo against absolutist dictatorship. I think it would be very embarrassing for him to try and move back to the model that Assad had, in which, it's a state which rules by terror, in which there are hundreds of thousands in prison, hundreds of thousands in mass graves. I don't think he can go back to that. I don't. His own base would accept that. But I think he is concentrating a lot of power in the presidency. He has not gone far enough to involve certain parts of society in governance, although he's going further now. In the last weeks, we've heard that he is going to reinstate defected officers from the previous army and police force, for example, which for a while it seemed he didn't want to do. He just wanted to do his HTS and allied militiamen in charge. So he is expanding the base of governance, or the selectorate, if you want to use that term. He's not doing it enough, and I think it's down to Syrians to build political parties, to build up an opposition, to protest, to build local democracy. Some of this is, but maybe not enough. And I think that over the next 5 years, we're going to see a lot of contestation within Syria between this attempt by Ahmad al-Sharaa and his people to build fairly autocratic, controlled democracy, and various other voices in society that will try to restrain him and try and build a bigger space, popular participation and other voices.
And in terms of the wider Middle East, like, where do you think, thinking about al-Sharaa going to Washington, and then, you know, where Turkey would fit in and where Israel would fit in, how do you see Syria in this kind of shifting Middle East now?
I mean, I think there's a regional alliance being formed, certainly, which brings together Turkey, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Qatar. Alliance may be too big a word for it, because, of course, Saudi Arabia and Qatar have problems. Saudi Arabia and Turkey have problems. But there is this kind of mainstream, if you like, Sunni, now that the Iranians have been put back into their box and they don't appear to be the big threat to everybody, there's this kind of realignment in which everybody wants more stability. We've been through a period of terrible instability, and I think the Turks and the Saudis and the Qataris, with Syria in the middle, are trying to establish a more stable situation in which Syria can rebuild, in which the immediate threats of Captagon drugs and refugees are not there. But I think alliance is too big a word for it. And I also don't think that Syria is entering into a proper alliance with the United States either, because we must remember that just before Ahmad al-Sharaa visited the United States, he visited Moscow, which again is in some ways an even bigger surprise, because it was Russia that was destroying Syrian cities not long ago, and it's Russia where Bashar al-Assad is living. So quite a few Syrians were even more unhappy about the Moscow visit than they have been about the Washington visit. But when you put the two together, it does look to me like intelligent politics. They're going out, they're doing diplomacy, they're cooperating where they can, but there's not yet any sign of them giving up anything, of them kind of really rolling over and letting foreign powers take advantage of Syria in the way that the old regime did. They are playing these powers off to an extent against each other. They're showing that they've got different options, and they're trying to, understandably, correctly, cooperate with everybody, because at the moment Syria has to, because Syria is on its back. It doesn't have a functioning economy. It doesn't have a functioning army.
I think it just passed recently to be the poorest country in the Arab world. So they need this period of stability where they can rebuild the economy, rebuild the security infrastructure. On that point about rebuilding the security infrastructure, part of my concern about what's happening is that I worry that we're just endlessly talking, and that the regional powers and global powers are thinking of Syria in the context of stability alone, and not in the context of how can you build a flourishing country, one that works for the people, one that can be rich, can be successful, and crucially, and this is the point I want to ask, strong. Because whenever you talk about Arab countries being stable, there's always an underlying current of, well, it has to be stable as long as Israel remains strong. And we've already seen this problem, I think, with Israel occupying vast parts of southwestern Syria. And also, as you were saying earlier, they bombed the Meze airport, they bombed the presidential palace, and so on. Well, how do you interpret that in the context of this rapprochement with America?
Well, I don't think we are yet there. I don't think that America is yet ready to properly to act against Israeli aggression. We hear America first, and still it's very much Israel first. But I must say, actually, although I really don't like Trump at all, and I can see how he's disastrous for American democracy and for the rights of immigrants and others in the United States, and he's bad for the world in many respects, he's bad for Ukraine. But for the Middle East, he's probably better than Biden would have been.
Right.
You know,
the deal maker in chief,
which is a very, very low, very, very low bar. But I also think it fits into his America First stuff, which is often nonsense, but it's not entirely nonsense. And I think Biden was really Israel first. And Trump can at least see that it is not in America's interests or the world's interests, for example, for the Israelis to be encouraging certain Druze leaders in the south of Syria to be going for independence, when that's a totally unrealistic thing, when it would totally destabilize Jordan as well as Syria. It would destabilize the whole region. It would give ISIS a whole new lease of life. So Trump can see that this kind of thing, Trump can see that the Israeli aim, which is to push Syria back into war and push it towards ethno-sectarian splintering, would be a disaster for the whole region. And Erdogan is telling him that, you know, the Iraqis are telling him that they won't be able to control their borders if this happens.
Let's talk about political ideology, which is something I know that you're very interested in. Perhaps the region has had rather too much political ideology, but you recently wrote a piece talking about how the collapse of the Assad regime means that really Baathism as an idea has pretty much collapsed across the Arab world. I wonder what you think the chances are of something replacing it is. Because at the moment, part of the difficulty, I think, with the modern Middle East is that there isn't really a through line in terms of political ideologies. There was an America first, there was an attempt to have a Russia first. These things just haven't panned out. We've seen the dismantling during the Gaza war of any Iran axis. That's gone away, or going away at least. What remains in terms of political ideologies?
I mean, I think it would be lovely if we could go into a post-ideological stage, but I don't think we necessarily are, because there's so many problems. I think parts of the world in which there's lots of ideology are parts of the world which have failed. They're parts of the world where there's crisis. So people, and we see that actually now coming into the West. So here I am in Scotland, which is unfortunately still part of the United Kingdom, and the Reform is the biggest party in the polls. It's doing best in the UK polls at the moment, which is a party which doesn't offer policies, it just offers hatred of the other.
Robin,
it offers
I'm going to interrupt you
ideology.
for a moment. That I often make a joke that a lot of the Westerners who think about the Arab world want to carve up the Arab world and split it into pieces, but they are very comfortable creating unity in the European Union in their own countries. You are consistent in that you're going the other way. You want the Arab world to be unified, but you want the West to be split into pieces. Why do you want the Scots to secede? Why?
Well, let's change the topic to that. Because I believe in democracy.
No, let's not.
Let's sure, because same in Syria as in Scotland. I believe in democracy, and I think that the more that people can control their own destiny, the better. And we don't necessarily, so I don't think that the Arab world will be necessarily stronger if everybody is amalgamated into one super state. If it's a dictatorship, I think the Arabs exist as Arabs culturally and politically. They share a lot of causes and interests. And if they have city-states which are democratic, I think they would be better off than having one huge state which unifies them all, which isn't democratic. And I don't think that there should be a border between England and Scotland. I don't think there should be any hard separation like that. But the Scots have not voted for a conservative government since the 1950s. But most of the governments that the United Kingdom has had since the 1950s have been conservative. The Scots voted 2/3 against Brexit, yet we had to have Brexit because the English voted for it. So it's just simply because I want democracy to work, because Scotland and England have such different politics, I would like them to be different countries. But we got into this when I was talking about reform. At the moment, because British politics and American politics and most of Europe now, the far right is rising. and people are being offered ideology, nativist ideologies or Islamophobic ideologies or anti-foreign ideologies as a replacement for economic success and for the sense of citizenship. And I would hope that in the new Syria, people will talk less and less and less about ideology and more and more about the practicalities of citizenship. I was having a discussion about identity with an Alawite friend. My Alawite friend was saying, look, the Ahmad al-Sharaa and the people that have come with him, their identity is Sunni. It's Sunni identity politics, which I largely agree with. His base is a Sunni base. And my friend was saying, I think that is the wrong identity for Syria, because Syrians are not just Sunni Muslims. Syrians are defined by their diversity and by the fact that all of these diverse peoples have cooperated on this land, in this climate, under this sky. And I said to him, I probably prefer your idea of identity to Ahmad al-Sharaa's idea of identity, but ultimately I think identity is a matter for novelists and poets. It's not a matter for politicians. Politicians should be worried about practicalities. How can we work together to build a good health service? How can we work together to defend our borders against Israeli aggression? How can we work together to educate our children?
Right, but these things are ideological questions. You can't have economics without ideology. You can't have even a conception of what strong borders would look like without an ideology. Who gets to live in those borders? Who gets let in, who doesn't get let in. You see this happening with the Trump administration. The Trump administration has decided that they want to allow white people to come in as refugees. That's why they're allowing only white South Africans. That is an ideological question about borders.
Sure. You can never escape ideology, absolutely. And even if you think you have, you're probably just stuck more deeply into another kind of ideology.
Yeah, no, the reason I raised it is that I know that you think a lot about these kind of big political ideologies. And I wonder if part of the reason we've had such a tumultuous 20, 30 years is that, and in general, not just in the Arab world, is that there aren't really these through lines of ideas any longer. People are kind of doing this Blairite third way where it's just whatever works in the moment, we stick with it.
I don't know. I don't think the grand narratives, let's change the title to grand narratives, big stories about Arabism or Islamism, or I don't think they've been very helpful. Certainly in the Arab world, I don't think they've been very helpful, because the people that have shouted about them the loudest have not been intellectuals or novelists or poets. As I said, I think these things are important, but they belong with intellectuals and novelists and poets. They're cultural matters. They've been hijacked or used, or most loudly, most obviously, by militias and states and dictators for their own reasons. So, Bashar al-Assad shouted about being a Ba'athist, but about one Arab nation and all of this, because he was constantly scheming against the other Arab nations. And whenever the Arab nations moved against him in any way, his media would resort immediately to quite racist, anti-Arab stereotyping in some cases. So the people that used these grand narratives, these big stories, to mobilize people behind them were very often bad actors. So I think it would be good for the people themselves to ask the people in charge that, okay, there's your big story, but we don't really need to hear the big story at the moment. We need to hear something practical. How are you actually going to improve our lives? How are you actually going to, I don't care if you're going to tell the children in school to sing an Islamic song or an Arabist song. What's important is that they end up being well educated and they can compete in the world and they can build a better country tomorrow. Those kind of questions.
I wanted to end by talking about a project you're currently working on, because you're currently the English editor for the ISIS Prisons Museum. And as part of that, you're obviously thinking a great deal about the trauma that has happened during the Syrian civil war and the impact of that collective trauma across the society. I wonder, when you think about this transitional period, I imagine that you believe that the dealing with the crimes, some sort of justice for these historical crimes, and the dealing with the trauma across the society are essential for the ability of the society to move on.
Absolutely. Let me just update you that we're not only doing the ISIS Prisons Museum, we also have another website now called the Syria Prisons Museum, which, because it became possible when the old regime, when the Assad regime fell, to actually go into its dungeons. So we've gone into Sednaya and dozens of other prisons, and we've documented those and interviewed survivors. And yeah, Syria is a totally traumatized society. There were hundreds of thousands of people ended up in mass graves. So hundreds of thousands starved or tortured to death in the worst ways, and their relatives know that and are wounded by that. And this is an immediate security problem every day in Syria. That and things like that. I mean, for example, in Morek, in the Hama countryside the other day, there was or a couple of weeks ago, there was fighting and houses were burnt down and families were shooting at each other because the Assad regime had confiscated pistachio orchards from disloyal people and given them to loyal people. So when the disloyal people returned from their refugee camps, they were saying, we want our land back. And the other people saying, but this belongs to us now. And this turns into a gun battle and people get killed. So there's no mechanism at present, or very little mechanism, for dealing with these thousands and hundreds of thousands of conflicts arising all over the country. And this really urgently needs to be done. Hundreds of thousands. It's everywhere. It's, millions of people have got something to be upset about and a reason to be angry with their neighbors.
Yeah.
Families set against families, not just sects against sects. And the government is dealing with it to some extent, but in many ways it's not, because it has its own understandable priorities. So Ahmad al-Sharaa, in some cases, is appointing, he is appointing people who have committed crimes to high ranks in the new army. And I understand why he's doing that. He's doing that not because they're his friends. In many cases, they were his enemies. And he's scared of them. He doesn't want to have a public fight. He doesn't want these guys to have a fight with his guys. So he's trying to co-opt them. But then there are other people in society saying, why on earth is this guy being appointed to a high position? He's committed crimes against us. We want justice. So this is very, very difficult. And the government and politicians need to work on it. And also people who produce culture need to work on it. I think all Syrians need to get involved with this. People who write the Musalsalat, the TV series, need to get involved. People who... everybody needs to get involved. This is a huge task in front of Syrian culture to try, and society to try to deal with this.
I want to ask you a bigger question about collective trauma, because sadly, it's not just Syria that has gone through this. I mean, a lot of the countries of the Arab Spring have gone through that trauma. We still have the problems of the Lebanese civil war. That still has not been resolved. There are still lots of people disappeared. Their families don't know the outcome, even though it's been decades. Iraq is still reeling. I know they just had an election, but they're still reeling. We still see some of the people who committed those crimes. John Bolton happily is being arrested, but Tony Blair has not been. And of course, there is Gaza, 2 years of this horrific war. I look at all of this trauma collectively across the region, and I wonder, for someone like you who spent a lot of time thinking about it, what you think the possibility is for a kind of healing and an ability for people to move forward.
I don't know the answer to that question. It's a very difficult question. I mean, in a lot of ways, you can see the cycles of killing and abuse in the Middle East. I mean, they've gone back, actually, to the last years of the Ottoman Empire. There was a kind of imperfect system during the Ottoman Empire, which at the end of the Ottoman Empire broke down, and massacres started then of particularly the Armenians and the Assyrians. Somebody called Umit.
You're talking about Umit Ungur. Yeah,
that's precisely what I'm talking about. Thank you, Faisal. And he wrote an essay for us at the Prisons Museum, for the ISIS Prisons Museum, for our website, about 100 years of genocide, from the 1915 genocide of the Armenians to the 2015 genocide of the Yazidis, in the same area, just circling again and again and again. And there's a great danger there that you see this happens, that the the Jewish state, so-called, in which I don't think this explains it entirely, but the trauma of the Holocaust and all the other horrible treatments of Jewish people in Europe and elsewhere over the centuries is then concentrated in Israel and is used as an excuse for committing abuses against other people. We are the eternal victims, so anything that we do cannot be a crime. It must be justifiable. And you see the Palestinians on October the 7th. I think some of those guys who went over with Hamas on October the 7th probably felt the same. It's justified what we do because of what these people have done against us again and again and again. And in Syria, you see this Mazlumiyya Sunniya, this kind of Sunni victimhood, the sense of Sunni, we have been treated badly for decades, which is true. So therefore, it's rubbish when people are blaming us for committing crimes. And this is terrible. We need to try and get beyond this collective thinking. We collectively are victims, and therefore we have the right to hurt other people or blame other people as collectivities. But how do you do it? I just don't know. And probably the answer is that we won't do it. Not properly. Human societies are very complicated, and positive things will happen in concert with the negative things. You know, some people will get over it, and there will be some great signs of that it's been got over, but some people won't get over it, and there will be things happening in a century's time. Crimes will be committed in a century's time, which will have been charged by the traumas of right now, you know.
I mean, I completely agree with you about, and we've talked about it before on this podcast, about the long tail of the Ottoman collapse. And I do think that we're still living through those days. I think historians will look back and say that this period right now, even though it's been literally 100 years since the Ottoman Empire started to collapse, we're still part of that same arc of history. I hope it isn't the way you describe it, that in 100 years we'll still be in the same arc of history. People will still be talking about it. Little Robin and little Faisal will still be like, you know what, this began 200 years ago, dear God. But you obviously believe, I want to end on an optimistic note. I mean, because of your work with the Syrian and ISIS prison museum, you obviously do believe that there is a way to get through this trauma. You must believe that there is a structural way that societies can get through it.
Yes and no. I mean, I believe that you do what you can and you don't know what the result is going to be. So it's always the right thing to try to document crimes, to try to give voice to the victims, and to try to work towards reconciliation based on a recognition of truth and an acknowledgement of what has been done. That's always the right thing to do, whether or not it succeeds. And it will always succeed to some extent. There will always be somebody who thinks, okay, at least my story has been heard. Even if it doesn't result in the guilty person being put in prison, of course, it's never going to work. It's never going to, the people whose relatives have been tortured to death by ISIS or by Assad or by anybody else are never going to get their relatives back. They're never going to stop having nightmares about their loved ones' last moments. But they could at least feel, okay, the story has been heard. At least the story of the person has been told. So you have to keep on working. And I do think that reconciliation and based on acknowledgement can go a long way to healing wounds. I think the kind of Truth and Reconciliation Commission that you saw in South Africa was very good. I think the crimes that have been committed in Gaza or in Syria are far bigger, actually, far worse than there's a lot more blood and horror in the Middle East than there was in apartheid South Africa even. But still, one has to work towards that as much as one possibly can, while recognizing that we're never going to, history doesn't work like that. You never come to a clear end. You know, we can always see that Germany is backing Israel more than it should be because of how it feels about the crimes that it committed in the 1940s. And that's understandable. This is states always, and communities and societies always act based on their historical traumas and their historical knowledge. We're never going to get away from it. We just have to try to educate people, educate ourselves, be as aware as we can, bring as many voices into the open as we can, so that many people are being heard and we're doing our best. All we can do is our best.
Robin Yassin-Kassab, thank you very much.
Thank you, Faisal.
That was Robin Yassin-Kassab. You've been listening to The Lead from New Lines magazine. This week's episode was produced by Finbar Anderson and hosted by me, Faisal Al Yafai. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favorite podcast app or visit our website, newlinesmag.com.